The sun hadn't yet crested the horizon when Sarah Mitchell stepped onto her front porch, coffee mug in hand, surveying the vast expanse of Texas prairie that stretched endlessly before her modest homestead. October 1847 had brought an unusual chill to the air, and she pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as she walked toward the well that sat 50 yards from her cabin. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had built this life with her own hands after her husband Thomas died of fever 2 summers prior. At 28, she possessed a stubborn independence that most frontier women couldn't afford. But Sarah wasn't most women. She'd learned to repair her own roof, mend her own fences, and shoot straight enough to keep wolves away from her small herd of cattle. The nearest neighbor lived 12 miles east, and the town of Cedar Falls was a full day's ride south. Solitude had become her companion, and she'd grown comfortable with its silence. The well had been giving her trouble lately. Thomas had dug it deep, nearly 40 feet down, to reach the underground spring that fed their land, but the wooden supports were beginning to rot. She'd been meaning to reinforce them before winter set in, but there never seemed to be enough hours in the day. As she approached the stone-lined opening, she could hear something that made her pause mid-step. It wasn't the usual sound of water echoing from the depths below. This was different, urgent, human. Sarah set down her coffee and leaned over the well's edge, peering into the darkness. The morning light barely penetrated the first few feet, leaving everything below shrouded in shadow. But the sound came again, a weak crying, definitely a child's voice, speaking words she couldn't understand, but carried a desperation that transcended language. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she called down into the well. "Hello? Is someone down there?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by what sounded like rapid, frightened breathing. Then a small voice spoke, the words clearly not English, but carrying the unmistakable tone of fear and pain. Sarah had lived on the frontier long enough to recognize the dialect, Comanche. The realization sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the morning air. Relations between white settlers and the Comanche tribes in this region had been tense for years, with raids and counter-raids creating an atmosphere of mutual distrust and violence. Most settlers in these parts would have walked away from that, well, or worse. But Sarah heard only one thing in that voice, a terrified child who needed help. She ran back to her cabin and gathered everything she could think of: rope, her oil lamp, a blanket, and her medical supplies. Thomas had been injured often enough during their early years that she'd become skilled at treating wounds and illness. If this child was hurt, she'd need to be ready. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old. When Sarah finally managed to lower herself into the well with her lamp, she found him huddled on a narrow ledge about 15 feet down, his left leg bent at an unnatural angle. His dark eyes were wide with terror and pain, but he'd stopped crying when he saw her approaching. Blood matted his black hair, and his buckskin clothing was torn and dirty. He spoke rapidly in Comanche when he saw her, his voice hoarse and desperate. Sarah didn't understand the words, but she recognized the tone of someone trying to explain something important. She held up her hands in what she hoped was a calming gesture and spoke softly. "I'm here to help you. I won't hurt you." The boy fell, silent, studying her face in the flickering lamplight. Whatever he saw there must have reassured him, because he nodded slightly and allowed her to examine his injuries. His leg was definitely broken, and he had a deep gash on his forehead that would need cleaning and stitching. But he was alive, and that was what mattered. Getting him out of the well proved to be the most challenging rescue Sarah had ever attempted. She had to fashion a makeshift pulley system using rope and a sturdy branch from the oak tree near her cabin. The boy, she decided to call him Little Wolf based on the wolf-tooth necklace he wore, gritted his teeth and remained silent throughout the entire ordeal, even when the movement obviously caused him excruciating pain. Once she had him safely in her cabin, Sarah set to work treating his injuries. She'd learned enough basic medical skills to set bones and stitch wounds, skills that were essential for anyone living so far from proper doctors. Little Wolf watched her every movement with intelligent dark eyes, occasionally speaking in Comanche, but never crying out even when she had to reset his broken leg. As she worked, Sarah found herself wondering how he'd ended up in her well. The nearest Comanche camps were supposed to be at least 50 miles north, according to what she'd heard in town. Had he been separated from his family during a hunt? Was he running from something? The questions swirled in her mind, but she pushed them aside. Right now, all that mattered was getting him healthy. The boy had a fever by evening, and Sarah spent the night applying cool cloths to his forehead and encouraging him to drink water. She'd made a simple broth from dried beef and vegetables. And though he was initially suspicious of her food, hunger eventually won out. He ate carefully, watching her face as if trying to determine whether she might poison him. On the second day, Little Wolf's fever broke, and he seemed more alert. Sarah had fashioned a crutch from a piece of wood and some cloth, and she helped him practice moving around the cabin. He was a quick learner and seemed determined not to show weakness, even though she could see the pain in his eyes with every step. It was during one of these practice sessions that Sarah began to understand just how intelligent this boy was. He pointed to various objects around the cabin and spoke their names in Comanche, then listened carefully as she said the English words. Within hours, he was attempting to repeat simple English phrases, and his pronunciation was remarkably good for someone so young. "Sarah," he said carefully, pointing to her after she'd repeated her name several times. She smiled and nodded encouragingly. "Yes, Sarah, and you?" She pointed to him. He considered for a moment, then spoke a word in Comanche that sounded like Ayana, but with subtle pronunciation differences that she couldn't quite master. "Ayana," she attempted. He shook his head and repeated the word more slowly. After several tries, Sarah managed something close enough that he nodded approvingly. By the third morning, Ayana was moving around much better, though he still needed the crutch. His English vocabulary had expanded to include basic words like water, food, thank you, and hurt. More importantly, some of his initial fear seemed to have faded. He still watched her carefully, but there were moments when she caught him looking around her cabin with what appeared to be curiosity rather than suspicion. Sarah had begun to consider her options. She could try to take him to town, but she had no idea how the people of Cedar Falls would react to her harboring a Comanche child. The frontier mentality was harsh, and many settlers viewed all Indians as enemies, regardless of age or circumstances. She could try to find his family herself, but she had no idea where to even begin looking, and traveling alone into Comanche territory would be suicide for a white woman. The decision was taken out of her hands on the afternoon of the third day. Sarah was outside hanging laundry when she first noticed the dust cloud on the horizon. Living alone had made her acutely aware of any changes in her environment, and this particular cloud was moving in a deliberate pattern that suggested riders rather than wind. Lots of riders. She called for Ayana, who hobbled outside on his crutch, to see what had caught her attention. The moment he saw the approaching dust cloud, his entire demeanor changed. He began speaking rapidly in Comanche, his voice filled with excitement and what sounded like relief. Sarah didn't need a translation to understand. His family had found him. As the riders drew closer, Sarah could make out individual figures. At least 20 Comanche warriors, their horses painted for war, their faces set in grim expressions. At their head rode a man who could only be a chief, his bearing proud and authoritative even at a distance. Ayana was practically bouncing with excitement despite his injured leg, calling out in Comanche to the approaching riders. But Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized the full implications of what was about to happen. She was a lone white woman who had been harboring a Comanche child for 3 days. No matter how good her intentions had been, she knew how this would look to a war party of angry warriors searching for a missing boy. The riders reached the edge of her property and stopped, forming a semicircle that effectively trapped her between them and her cabin. The chief dismounted and walked forward, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the scene before him. He was a tall man, probably in his 40s, with silver streaking his black hair and scars that spoke of many battles. When he looked at Sarah, she saw intelligence and caution, but also something that might have been gratitude. Ayana hobbled forward eagerly, speaking rapidly in Comanche and gesturing towards Sarah. The chief listened without interruption, occasionally asking what appeared to be questions. Other warriors had dismounted as well, and Sarah could feel their eyes on her, assessing, judging. When Ayana finished his explanation, a long silence fell over the group. The chief studied Sarah for what felt like an eternity, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his English heavily accented but clear. "You saved my son," Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Up close, she could see the family resemblance between the chief and Ayana, the same intelligent dark eyes, the same proud bearing even in the boy's injured state. "He tells me you fed him, healed his wounds, and treated him with kindness." The chief's voice was measured, careful. "This is not what I expected to find." "He was hurt and scared," Sarah managed to say. "I couldn't just leave him in the well." The chief nodded slowly. "Many of your people would have." It wasn't a question, and Sarah knew it was true. The frontier had made enemies of their peoples, and compassion was often seen as weakness or naivety, but she'd acted on instinct, not politics. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "What happens now?" she asked. The chief looked at his son, who was still chattering excitedly, in Comanche, apparently telling the other warriors about his adventures in Sarah's cabin. Then he looked back at Sarah, and she saw something shift in his expression. "Now," he said quietly, "we talk." The chief gestured for Sarah to sit on the wooden steps of her porch, while he remained standing, a positioning that she recognized as both respectful and strategic. His warriors maintained their semicircle formation, but she noticed several had relaxed their grip on their weapons. Ayana had positioned himself between his father and Sarah, still favoring his injured leg, but clearly eager to continue serving as translator. "I am Chief Running Bear of the Pinatika Band," the chief began, his English deliberate and formal. "This land where you live, it has been traveled by my people for many generations. The spring that feeds your well, we have drunk from it since before the white settlers came." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She'd purchased this land legally from the territorial government, but she was beginning to understand that legal ownership and traditional usage were two very different concepts on the frontier. Ayana was hunting with his older brother when they encountered a group of white men 3 days ago, Running Bear continued. There was shooting, his brother's horse was killed, and in the confusion, Ayana's horse bolted. The men chased him, but he managed to escape. In the darkness, he fell into your well. The story painted a picture that made Sarah's stomach clench. The men who were chasing him, do you know who they were? Running Bear's expression darkened. "We found their camp yesterday, buffalo hunters from the south, but they carried themselves like soldiers. They had scalps hanging from their belts." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "Not all were warriors. Sarah understood immediately. The scalps included women, children, and non-combatants. These weren't men defending themselves against raids. They were bounty hunters, collecting proof of kills for payment from territorial authorities who wanted the Comanche problem solved permanently. "Ayana's brother?" she asked quietly. "Wounded, but alive. He made it back to our camp and told us what happened. We have been searching for 3 days." Running Bear's voice carried the weight of a father's fear and relief. "We expected to find a body. Instead, we find our son healthy and speaking words of English, telling us of a white woman who showed him kindness." One of the warriors approached and spoke rapidly in Comanche. Running Bear listened, then nodded and responded. The conversation was brief but intense, and Sarah caught enough inflection to understand it wasn't entirely friendly. "My brother Stonewolf believes this is a trap," Running Bear explained. "He thinks you kept Ayana alive to use as bait, to draw us into an ambush. He wants to know why the other white men have not appeared." Sarah looked at the warrior who had spoken. Stonewolf was younger than Running Bear, perhaps in his 30s, with a lean build and eyes that held deep suspicion. Several scalps hung from his belt, and his war paint was fresh. This was a man who had seen too much violence to trust easily. "There are no other white men," Sarah said simply. "I live alone." Stonewolf spoke again, his tone sharp and questioning. Running Bear translated without being asked. "He wants to know why you live alone. He says white women do not live without men to protect them unless something is wrong." Sarah considered her answer carefully. The truth was complicated, and she wasn't sure how much these men would understand about a woman choosing independence over remarriage. But something about Running Bear's steady gaze told her that honesty would serve her better than evasion. "My husband died 2 years ago of fever. Other men in town wanted me to marry them so they could claim this land, but I preferred to keep it for myself. I can take care of myself." Running Bear translated this exchange, and Sarah watched the warriors' faces as they processed her words. Some looked skeptical, others curious. Stonewolf appeared unconvinced, but she caught a few of the older warriors nodding with what might have been respect. "You have children?" Running Bear asked. "No." The word came out more curtly than she intended, carrying old pain that she usually kept buried. "We were not blessed with children." Ayana, who had been following the conversation as best he could, suddenly spoke up in his mixture of Comanche and broken English. He gestured animatedly towards Sarah, then mimicked her actions of the past 3 days, treating his wounds, helping him walk, feeding him. The other warriors listened intently as he described her care. When he finished, an older warrior with grey streaking his hair approached and examined Ayana's leg. He spoke to Running Bear, who nodded and turned back to Sarah. "Crowfeather is our medicine man. He says the bone was set properly and is healing well. This is not easy to do." Running Bear's tone carried new respect. "You have training in healing?" "My husband was often injured when we were starting this homestead. I learned what I could from books and necessity." Sarah gestured toward her cabin. "I have medical supplies inside if you'd like to see them." Stonewolf immediately objected, his voice sharp with suspicion. The conversation that followed was heated, with several warriors taking sides. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but the body language was clear. They were debating whether to trust her enough to enter her home. Finally, Running Bear raised his hand for silence. He spoke briefly to Stonewolf, who reluctantly nodded, then turned to Sarah. "I will come inside with Crowfeather to see these supplies. The others will wait here." Sarah led them into her modest cabin, acutely aware of how small and vulnerable it must seem to men, accustomed to the vast openness of the plains. Her medical supplies were stored in a wooden box that Thomas had built for her. Bottles of laudanum and carbolic acid, rolls of clean bandages, needles and thread for stitching wounds, and various herbs she'd gathered and dried. Crowfeather examined each item carefully, occasionally asking Running Bear to translate questions about their uses. His knowledge of traditional medicine was extensive, and Sarah found herself engaged in an unexpected technical discussion about the merits of different treatments for various ailments. "You made this medicine?" Crowfeather asked through Running Bear, holding up a bottle of willow bark extract that Sarah had prepared for treating fever and pain. "Yes, I learned that willow bark contains something that reduces fever. I make it into a tea or extract." Crowfeather nodded approvingly and said something to Running Bear that made the chief smile slightly. "He says you understand the spirit of plants, even if you learned it from books instead of from your grandmother." As they talked, Sarah became aware of a commotion outside. Voices were raised, and she could hear horses approaching rapidly. Running Bear and Crowfeather immediately moved to the windows, their relaxed demeanor vanishing in an instant. "More riders coming from the south," Running Bear said grimly. "Moving fast." Sarah looked out her front window and felt her heart sink. A group of at least 15 mounted men was approaching at a gallop, and even at a distance she could see they were heavily armed. At their head rode a man she recognized, Jake Morrison, a self-appointed militia leader from Cedar Falls who had made his hatred of Indians well known in the local saloons. "You know these men?" Running Bear asked, his hand moving instinctively to his knife. "Some of them. They're from the town south of here. The leader is Jake Morrison. He organizes groups to hunt Indians for bounty money." Running Bear's expression hardened. "The men who chased Ayana." Sarah studied the approaching riders more carefully. "I can't tell from here, but it's possible. Morrison leads different groups on different hunts." Outside, Stonewolf was barking orders in Comanche. The warriors quickly took defensive positions, using Sarah's cabin, well, and outbuildings as cover. Their earlier relaxed posture had vanished, replaced by the fluid efficiency of men who had fought many battles. Morrison's group pulled up about 50 yards away, just outside easy rifle range. Morrison himself rode forward a few more paces, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "Sarah Mitchell," he called out, "you got yourself surrounded by hostiles there. We're here to help." Sarah stepped out onto her porch, very aware that both groups of armed men were watching her every move. Running Bear and Crowfeather remained inside, but she could feel their presence behind her. "I'm fine, Jake," she called back. "There's no trouble here?" "That's not what it looks like from where I'm sitting." Morrison's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "We tracked a Comanche raiding party to your land, found signs they've been here for days. They're not raiding anyone. They came to collect a child who was injured." Morrison's laugh was harsh and disbelieving. "Sarah, you've been living alone too long. It's affected your thinking. Indians don't just come calling for social visits. They're planning something, and you're either part of it or you're their prisoner." Several of Morrison's men had spread out, trying to get better positions for shooting. Sarah noticed that the Comanche warriors had done the same, and the tension in the air was becoming thick enough to cut. "I'm not anyone's prisoner, Jake. The boy fell into my well 3 days ago. I helped him, and now his family has come to take him home." "That's all this is? Boy!" Morrison's voice sharpened with interest. "You mean you've been harboring one of them?" "Sarah, that's aiding the enemy. That's treason against the territory." Sarah felt anger flare in her chest. "That's helping an injured, a child, something anyone with a conscience would do." "Conscience don't apply to savages," Morrison spat. "You've been living out here alone too long, Sarah. Your judgment's gone soft. Now step away from that cabin so we can handle this proper." "No." The single word hung in the air like a gunshot. Morrison's face darkened with anger and disbelief. "What did you say?" "I said no, Jake. These people haven't done anything wrong, and neither have I. You and your men need to leave my property." Morrison's hand tightened on his gun. "Sarah, you're making a big mistake. We've got territorial authority to deal with hostile Indians, and that's what we're going to do. Now get out of the way before you get hurt." Running Bear stepped out onto The porch beside Sarah moving with deliberate calm. His presence immediately shifted the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Morrison's men tensed, several raising their rifles. "My name is Running Bear," the chief said, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "I have come to collect my son, who was injured and cared for by this woman. We have no quarrel with you." "The hell you don't," Morrison snarled. "Every one of you red devils is a quarrel with decent white folks. You've got about 10 seconds to surrender before we start shooting." Running Bear didn't move, but Sarah heard him speak quietly in Comanche. Whatever he said caused subtle shifts in the positions of his warriors. They were preparing for battle. "Jake, please," Sarah tried. "One more time." "There doesn't have to be fighting. These people just want to take their boy and leave." "There's always fighting when it comes to Indians," Morrison replied. "Only question is whether we finish it now or wait for them to come back with more warriors to burn you out. I'm trying to save your life, Sarah, whether you're smart enough to appreciate it or not." Ayana suddenly appeared in the doorway behind his father, leaning heavily on his crutch, but determined to see what was happening. The sight of the injured boy seemed to make Morrison even angrier. "Look at that," he called to his men. "She's been nursing a future warrior back to health, probably be killing white children in 10 years, thanks to her soft heart." That was apparently the final straw for Stonewolf. Sarah heard him shout something in Comanche that needed no translation. It was clearly a battle cry. The warriors began moving toward better fighting positions, and Morrison's men responded by raising their weapons. Sarah found herself standing between two groups of armed men who were seconds away from turning her homestead into a battlefield. She had to make a choice, and she had to make it now. "Stop!" she shouted, loud enough to be heard by both groups. "All of you, just stop!" She walked down from her porch and positioned herself directly in the space between the two forces, her arms spread wide. "Jake Morrison, I am ordering you off my land. This is my property, legally purchased and registered with the territorial government. You have no authority here." "Sarah, get out of the way," Morrison warned. "We're not leaving until this is settled." "Then you're going to have to shoot me first," Sarah said quietly. "Because I'm not moving." The silence that followed was deafening. Both groups of men stared at her in disbelief. A lone woman standing in no man's land, refusing to back down from either side. It was Running Bear who broke the silence, speaking in Comanche to his warriors. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but she heard the authority in his voice. Whatever he said caused his men to lower their weapons slightly. Morrison, however, was not so easily deterred. "Sarah, you're making the biggest mistake of your life. Step aside now, or we'll consider you an enemy combatant." Sarah looked him straight in the eye. "Then that's what you'll have to do, Jake. But I won't be party to murder on my own land." The standoff stretched on, tension crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. Sarah could feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders, the weight of all the hatred and violence that had brought these two groups of men to the brink of battle in her front yard. Something had to give. The question was what, and who would make the first move? The tension stretched like a bowstring, ready to snap when the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed from the east. All eyes turned toward the new dust cloud rising on the horizon, and Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized the situation was about to become even more complicated. Morrison grinned with savage satisfaction. "That'll be Captain Henderson and his cavalry unit from Fort Davis. Sent word to them yesterday when we picked up the Indian trail. Looks like your red friends are about to face some real firepower." But as the riders drew closer, Sarah could see this wasn't a military unit. The approaching group wore civilian clothes and rode in the loose formation of traders or travelers, not soldiers. At their head rode a tall man with silver-streaked hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades on the frontier. Running Bear spoke sharply to his warriors in Comanche, and Sarah caught the tension in his voice. These weren't reinforcements for Morrison, but they weren't necessarily allies either. In a situation this volatile, any new players could tip the balance toward bloodshed. The newcomers reined in their horses about 30 yards away, close enough to assess the situation but far enough to avoid being drawn into immediate conflict. Their leader dismounted and walked forward with the confident stride of a man accustomed to command. "Well now," he said, his voice carrying a slight Irish accent, "this is quite the gathering we've stumbled upon. Thomas McBride's name, and I'm wondering if someone might explain why we've got two armed camps facing off in what appears to be a lady's front yard." Morrison's expression soured at this interruption to his planned assault. "This is official territorial business, McBride. These are hostile Comanche, and we're here to deal with them according to law." McBride's weathered face creased into what might have been amusement. "Hostile, you say? Funny thing about that, I've been trading with Running Bear's band for nigh on 15 years, and I've never known him to break his word or attack without provocation." He looked directly at the chief. "Running Bear, what brings you so far south of your usual territory?" Running Bear stepped forward slightly, his dignity intact despite the precarious situation. "My son was lost 3 days ago while hunting. This woman found him injured and cared for him. We came to bring him home." "Ah," McBride nodded as if this explained everything. "And you, Morrison, decided this was cause for a shooting war?" "They're Indians," Morrison snarled. "They don't belong on white land, and she's been harboring one of their spawn. That makes her a traitor to her own kind." McBride's expression hardened. "Her own kind. Son, I've known Sarah Mitchell since before her husband died, and if you're questioning her character or her loyalty, you're talking to the wrong Irishman about it." Sarah felt a wave of relief at hearing a friendly voice, but she also recognized that McBride's presence, while welcome, might not be enough to prevent violence. Morrison had 15 armed men, and his blood was up. He wasn't going to back down easily. "Besides," McBride continued, turning his attention back to Morrison, "I've got papers here from Territorial Governor Henderson authorizing me to negotiate trading agreements with peaceful Indian bands. Running Bear's people have been designated as non-hostile, which means any attack on them would be a violation of territorial law." Morrison's face turned an ugly shade of red. "That's horse dung, McBride, and you know it. There ain't no such thing as peaceful Indians. They're all savages, and the only good one is a dead one. Is that so?" McBride reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a leather portfolio. "Well then, perhaps you'd like to explain that opinion to Governor Henderson personally. I've got his signed authorization right here, along with a letter of safe passage. For Chief Running Bear and his people, the papers might have been genuine, or they might have been an elaborate bluff." Sarah couldn't tell from where she stood, but Morrison's hesitation suggested he wasn't certain either. In territorial politics, challenging the wrong authority could end a man's career, or worse. While Morrison studied the documents, Stonewolf moved closer to his brother and spoke urgently in Comanche. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but the warrior's body language suggested he was advocating for immediate action. Running Bear listened, then shook his head firmly and replied in a tone that brooked no argument. Iana, still leaning on his crutch in the cabin doorway, suddenly called out in English, his young voice cutting through the tension. "Father, the white medicine woman saved my life. She could have left me in the dark place to die, but she didn't. Stonewolf is wrong about her." The boy's words seemed to resonate with several of the Comanche warriors, who began speaking among themselves. In low tones, Sarah realized that Ayana's opinion carried weight. He was the only one present who had actually experienced her care and could testify to her character. McBride handed the papers back to Morrison with a gesture that suggested the matter was settled. Now then, it seems to me we've got a simple situation here. The boy's been returned to his family. No harm done to anyone, and everyone can go their separate ways. Unless, of course, someone's looking to start an Indian war over a misunderstanding. This ain't no misunderstanding, Morrison growled, but some of the fire had gone out of his voice. She harbored an enemy combatant. That's aiding and abetting, and it's against territorial law. Enemy combatant? McBride's eyebrows rose. Morrison, the boy couldn't be more than 8 years old, and from what I can see, he's got a broken leg. What kind of threat does that pose to the territorial security? Sarah decided it was time to speak up. Jake, you keep talking about territorial law, but you haven't shown me any warrant or legal authority for being on my land. This is my property, and I'm ordering you to leave. Morrison's hand moved toward his gun again. Lady, you're in no position to be giving orders to anyone. You've made your choice, and now you get to live with the consequences. The consequences of helping an injured child? Sarah's voice carried an edge of steel that surprised even her. The consequences of showing basic human decency? If that's what passes for criminal behavior in your world, Jake Morrison, then I'll wear that badge with pride. One of Morrison's men, a young cowboy who couldn't have been more than 20, lowered his rifle slightly. Mr. Morrison, maybe we should listen to what Mr. McBride's saying, if the governor really has given them safe passage. Shut up, Collins, Morrison snapped. I give the orders here. But Sarah could see that doubt was beginning to creep into the ranks of Morrison's men. Several were glancing uneasily at McBride's papers, and the presence of witnesses who weren't. Part of their group was clearly making them uncomfortable. Running Bear seemed to sense the shift in momentum. He spoke to his son in Comanche, and Ayana responded by hobbling over to stand beside Sarah. The gesture was small but significant. The boy was publicly choosing to trust her, even in the face of potential violence. Mr. Morrison, running. Bear said formally, my son tells me you and your men are the same ones who attacked him and his brother 3 days ago. You shot at children who were hunting rabbits, not making war. Morrison's face flushed darker. Any Indian with a weapon is making war, as far as I'm concerned. They had hunting bows, Running Bear replied calmly. For small game, not weapons for fighting men. McBride whistled low. Morrison, please tell me you didn't attack a couple of boys out hunting. Please tell me that's not what this is really about. I don't have to explain my actions to you, McBride. We're here on official business. Official business. McBride's voice carried a dangerous edge now. Son, if you've been hunting children for scalp bounties, that's not official business. That's murder. And it's going to bring down a world of trouble on everyone involved. The young cowboy, Collins, took a step back from his companions. Mr. Morrison, you told us we were chasing a war party that had attacked settlers. You didn't say nothing about hunting boys. Collins, I warned you to keep your mouth shut, Morrison snarled, but more of his men were beginning to look uncertain. Sarah realized this might be her chance to end the standoff without bloodshed. Jake, you made a mistake. I understand that. Tensions are high on the frontier, and sometimes good men make bad decisions when they're trying to protect their communities. But this doesn't have to end in violence. Don't you dare patronize me, Sarah Mitchell, Morrison spat. I've been protecting this territory while you've been playing house with savages. I've been living my life according to my conscience, Sarah replied firmly. And my conscience tells me that helping an injured child was the right thing to do, regardless of his race or the politics involved. Stonewolf suddenly stepped forward and spoke directly to Morrison in broken but understandable English. You want fight? We fight. But we know this land better than you. We know where you live, where your families sleep. You start war here, war does not end here. The threat was delivered calmly, almost conversationally, but its impact was immediate. Several of Morrison's men exchanged worried glances. They'd signed up to hunt Indians for bounty money, not to trigger a war that would endanger their own families. McBride seized the moment. "Gentlemen, I think we've heard enough threats for one day. Morrison, you've got your answer. The boy's going home with his family, and there's no crime been committed here. I suggest you and your men ride back to Cedar Falls and find something more productive to do with your time." "This isn't over," Morrison said, but Sarah could hear the defeat in his voice. The combination of official papers, witness testimony, and the growing unease among his own men had undermined his position. "Sarah, you've made enemies today. Don't expect any help from decent folks when the consequences catch up with you." "I'll take my chances," Sarah replied. Morrison glared at her for a long moment, then turned to his men. "Mount up. We're leaving." As Morrison's group rode away, the tension in the air began to dissipate, but Sarah knew the confrontation had changed. Something fundamental. She'd taken a public stand that would have consequences throughout the territory. News of what happened here would spread, and she'd have to live with the results. Running Bear approached her as the dust settled. "You risked much for my son. Why?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Because it was the right thing to do. Because he's a child who needed help. Because—" She paused, searching for words to explain something she wasn't sure she fully understood herself. "Because I believe there has to be a better way for our people to live together than constant war. Many on both sides would call you foolish for believing such a thing," Running Bear said quietly. "Maybe they're right," Sarah admitted. "But I'd rather be foolish with hope than wise with hatred." Ayana spoke up from beside her, his English more confident than it had been just days before. "Father, she has good medicine, not just for healing bodies, but for healing hearts too." Running Bear smiled at his son, then looked back at Sarah with something that might have been respect. "My son sees clearly even when he is young. You have given us a gift that cannot be repaid with horses or hides." "I don't want repayment," Sarah said. "I just want him to grow up healthy and happy." "That is what all parents want for their children," Running Bear replied. "Perhaps that is where understanding begins." McBride had been quietly listening to the exchange, and now he stepped forward. "Sarah, I meant what I said about knowing your character. But Morrison was right about one thing. There will be consequences to what happened here today. Word's going to spread that you stood up to a scalp hunter to protect Comanche. That's going to make you friends in some quarters and enemies in others." Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. The frontier was a place where choosing sides could mean the difference between life and death, and she'd just chosen her side very publicly. "I'll deal with whatever comes," she said simply. Running Bear spoke to his warriors in Comanche, and they began moving toward their horses. The crisis was over, but Sarah sensed that something larger was just beginning. She'd crossed a line today, stepped outside the expectations of her society and her race. There would be no going back to the simple life she'd tried to build for herself. As the Comanche prepared to leave, Crow Feather approached her with something wrapped in soft deerskin. He spoke to Running Bear, who translated. He says this is a gift to thank you for caring for Ayana. It is medicine made from plants that grow only in our sacred places. It will help with healing, but more than that, it carries the blessing of our people. Sarah accepted the gift with gratitude, understanding that she was receiving more than just medicine. She was being acknowledged as a friend to the Comanche nation. Ayana hobbled over to her one last time, his crutch tapping against the hard-packed earth. In his mixture of English and Comanche, he said something that Running Bear translated with a smile. He says you will always be his white mother, and if you ever need help, you have only to send word to the Penateca band. We will come. As the Comanche rode away into the gathering dusk, Sarah stood alone in her yard, watching until they disappeared into the vastness of the Texas plains. The silence that followed felt different than the solitude she'd known before. Heavier, with possibility and consequence. McBride remained behind, his trading party making camp near her well with practiced efficiency. As night fell, he joined her on her porch, both of them staring out at the stars that seemed impossibly bright in the clear frontier sky. "You know there's no going back from this," he said quietly. "I know. Morrison's not going to forget what happened here. Men like him don't forgive being humiliated, especially not by a woman." Sarah sipped her coffee and considered this. "Then I guess I'll have to be ready for whatever he brings next. You planning to stay here? Alone?" "This is my home," Sarah said firmly. "I'm not running." McBride nodded approvingly. "Good. The frontier needs more people with backbone and fewer with just bullets." He paused, then added, "But backbone alone might not be enough if Morrison decides to come back with a bigger group." Sarah had been thinking the same thing, but hearing it spoken aloud made the reality more concrete. She'd made powerful enemies today, and they wouldn't hesitate to use violence to settle the score. "What would you suggest?" she asked. McBride was quiet for a long moment, apparently weighing his words carefully. "Well, there might be options. People who think like you do, who believe there's got to be a better way than constant fighting, but it would mean getting involved in something bigger than just your homestead." "What kind of something?" "The kind that could change the whole territory," McBride said quietly, "but also the kind that could get you killed if you choose the wrong side." As Sarah pondered his cryptic words, she realized that saving Ayanna from the well had been just the beginning. She'd set in motion forces that would reshape not only her own life, but the entire relationship between white settlers and the Comanche nation. The question now was whether she had the courage to see it through to the end. 3 weeks after the confrontation in her yard, Sarah discovered exactly what McBride had meant about choosing sides. She was mending a section of fence damaged by a recent storm when she spotted a lone rider approaching from the direction of Cedar Falls. The horse moved at an urgent pace, and as it drew closer, she recognized Martha Henley, the preacher's wife. From town, Martha's usual composure was gone, replaced by obvious distress. Her hair had escaped its normally perfect bun, her dress was dusty from hard riding, and her face bore the expression of someone carrying terrible news. "Sarah!" Martha called out before she'd even dismounted. "Thank God you're alive! We heard rumors in town that Morrison's men had—" She trailed off, apparently unwilling to voice her fears. Sarah set down her hammer and walked over to help Martha from her horse. "I'm fine, Martha. What's got you so worked up? Morrison came back to town 3 days ago, claiming you'd been taken captive by a Comanche war party. He said he tried to rescue you but was driven off by superior numbers." Martha's words tumbled. "Out in a rush. He's been organizing a bigger expedition, claiming it's his Christian duty to save you from a fate worse than death." Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. How big an expedition? Near 40 men, and they've sent word to Fort Davis requesting military support. Captain Henderson's supposedly considering it. Martha searched Sarah's face for signs of trauma. "But you weren't captured, were you? You look perfectly well." "Sit down, Martha. I'll get you some water, and then I'll tell you what really happened." As Martha rested in the shade of Sarah's porch, Sarah recounted the true events of 3 weeks ago. She watched her friend's expression change from relief to confusion to alarm as the story unfolded. "You mean Morrison lied about everything?" Martha asked when Sarah finished. "The war party, your capture, the rescue attempt, every word of it. He attacked a child and his brother, then tried to murder the family when they came to collect their boy." Martha was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "Sarah, you have to understand how this looks to people in town. Morrison's version makes him a hero trying to save a helpless woman. Your version makes him a liar and a would-be murderer." Sarah finished. "I know how it looks, Martha, but I also know what I saw. The problem is, nobody else saw it except you and the Indians, and in Cedar Falls, the word of Indians doesn't carry much weight against the word of a white man. Sarah had been dreading this conversation, but she'd known it was inevitable. Small frontier communities survived on shared trust and common cause. By aligning herself with the Comanche against fellow whites, she'd violated an unspoken but fundamental rule of frontier society. There's something else, Martha continued reluctantly. Morrison's been telling people that your isolation has affected your mind. He's suggesting that you've developed unnatural sympathies for the Indians because you've been alone too long. The implication was clear and insulting. In the 1840s, a woman who defied conventional wisdom about racial relations could easily be dismissed as hysterical or mentally unstable. It was a convenient way to discredit her testimony without having to address the substance of her claims. And people believe him? Martha's hesitation was answer enough. Some do, others aren't sure what to think. But Sarah, the fact remains that Morrison has 40 armed men ready to ride out here in a few days. Whether they believe his story or not, they're not going to back down when they arrive and find you safe and sound. It'll make them look foolish, and men don't like being made to look foolish. Sarah considered her options. She could try to leave, but running would only confirm Morrison's claims about her mental state. She could try to convince the townspeople of the truth, but Martha was right. Her word against Morrison's wouldn't carry much weight, especially when her version painted their fellow whites as the villains. "What would you do, Martha?" Sarah asked. Martha was quiet for a long time, staring out at the prairie that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. "Honestly, if I were in your position, I'd probably pack up and head east, find a city where nobody knows the story and start over. And leave Morrison to continue hunting children for bounty money? Sarah, you can't save the world. Sometimes the best you can do is save yourself." But even as Martha spoke the words, Sarah could see in her friend's expression that she didn't really believe them. Martha Henley had spent her life as a preacher's wife, ministering to the sick and poor, standing up for those who couldn't defend themselves. She understood the moral imperative that drove Sarah's actions, even if she couldn't bring herself to endorse them publicly. What if there was another way? Sarah asked. What if I could prove Morrison was lying without just relying on my word against his? Martha looked skeptical. How would you do that? Sarah was thinking of McBride's cryptic comments about people who thought like she did, about options that could change the whole territory. "I'm not sure yet, but I think I might know someone who could help." That evening, after Martha had returned to town with promises to send word if Morrison's expedition moved faster than expected, Sarah sat on her porch and considered her situation. She was essentially under siege, facing an enemy who controlled the narrative and had superior numbers. In military terms, her position was untenable. But Sarah had learned something from her encounter with Running Bear that Morrison probably hadn't considered. The Comanche chief had mentioned that his people knew this land better than the white settlers, knew where families slept, and how to wage war on their own terms. If Morrison was determined to turn this into a conflict, perhaps it was time to make use of the alliance she'd inadvertently created. The next morning brought visitors from an unexpected direction. Sarah was drawing water from her well when she noticed riders approaching from the north, the direction of Comanche territory. As they drew closer, she recognized Stone Wolf leading a small group of warriors. Unlike their previous visit, this group moved with the stealth and purpose of a war party. Stone Wolf dismounted and approached her with the formal bearing she remembered from their first encounter. His English had improved noticeably since their last meeting. "Sarah Mitchell," he said with careful pronunciation, "I bring words from Running Bear. Is everything all right? Is Ayana well?" The boy healed strongly. He speaks often of the white medicine woman who saved his life. Stonewolf's expression remained serious. But we have heard troubling news. White men from the southern town gather weapons and horses. They speak of war against our people. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. How did you hear this? We have friends. Among the traders, they tell us Morrison claims you were taken by force, that rescue is needed. Stonewolf studied her face carefully. This is not true? No, it's not true. Morrison is using lies to justify an attack on your people. He wants revenge for being humiliated in front of his men. Stonewolf nodded grimly. This is what Running Bear thought. He sends me to offer protection. You saved his son. Now we save you. The offer was both generous and problematic. Accepting Comanche protection would confirm every accusation Morrison had made about her loyalties. But refusing it might mean facing 40 armed men alone. What kind of protection? Sarah asked. We take you north to our winter camp. You live with our people until danger passes. Running Bear's wife will welcome you as a sister. Sarah was touched by the offer, but she knew it wasn't a real solution. Stonewolf, if I disappear right before Morrison's expedition arrives, it will only confirm his story. He'll tell everyone that the Comanche came back and took me captive. It will give him justification for a war against your people. Stonewolf considered this, his expression thoughtful. Then what do you propose? Before Sarah could answer, another dust cloud appeared on the horizon, this one from the east. As the riders approached, she recognized McBride's trading party, returning from whatever business had taken them away for the past 3 weeks. Maybe I don't have to propose anything, Sarah said. Maybe the solution is about to present itself. McBride rode up to the gathering with the casual air of a man accustomed to finding unusual situations in his travels. He nodded politely to Stonewolf, then dismounted and approached Sarah. Miss Mitchell, I see you're entertaining guests again. I take it this visit is related to the rumors I've been hearing in my travels? What rumors? That Jake Morrison is raising an army to rescue you from Comanche captivity, and that he's petitioned the territorial government for official support. McBride's expression was grim. I also heard that Governor Henderson is considering the request, partly because of pressure from influential citizens in Cedar Falls. Sarah felt the last of her options slipping away. If the territorial government officially sanctioned Morrison's expedition, it would become more than just a personal vendetta. It would be an act of war, with all the resources of the territory behind it. There's something else, McBride continued. I've been to Austin, meeting with certain parties who share your views about finding alternatives to constant warfare. The governor's decision on Morrison's request is going to serve as a test case for territorial policy toward peaceful Indian relations. Stonewolf had been following the conversation with obvious concern. You speak of territorial government. What is their decision? McBride looked between Sarah and Stonewolf, apparently weighing how much to reveal. That depends on what happens in the next few days. If Morrison's expedition proceeds and finds evidence supporting his claims about Comanche aggression, the governor will likely authorize expanded military action against all Comanche bands, peaceful or not. And if the expedition finds no such evidence, then Morrison loses credibility, and the territorial government might be more open to alternative approaches. McBride paused significantly, but only if the right evidence is presented in the right way by the right people. Sarah began to understand what McBride was suggesting. You want to use Morrison's expedition as an opportunity to expose his lies publicly. More than that, I want to use it as a demonstration that peaceful coexistence is possible between whites and Indians, but it would require careful planning and considerable courage from everyone involved. Stonewolf stepped forward. What do you propose? McBride looked around at the assembled group. Sarah, Stonewolf, his own trading party, and the vast Texas prairies stretching in all directions. I propose we give Morrison exactly what he's looking for, a dramatic rescue mission. But instead of the war he wants, we give him a demonstration of peace. The plan McBride outlined was audacious and risky. When Morrison's force arrived expecting to find Sarah held captive by hostile Comanche, they would instead find her free and unharmed, hosting a peaceful gathering between white traders and Comanche representatives. The contrast between Morrison's war rhetoric and the reality of cooperative relations would be stark and public. The key, McBride explained, is documentation. I've got official observers coming from Austin, territorial officials who will witness everything and report back to the governor. Morrison won't be able to spin this his way if there are credible government witnesses to contradict him. Stone Wolf listened to the plan with growing interest. And if Morrison refuses to accept what he sees, if he attacks anyway, then he'll be attacking peaceful civilians in front of territorial officials, which would end his career and probably land him in prison. McBride's expression was confident. Morrison's not stupid, just prejudiced. When faced with those consequences, he'll back down. Sarah saw the elegance of the plan, but she also saw its dangers. What if Morrison doesn't back down? What if his hatred overrides his self-preservation? Then we'll be ready for that too, McBride said quietly. But I don't think it will come to that. Morrison's power comes from controlling the narrative. Take that away from him, and he's just another bully with a gun. Stone Wolf spoke briefly with his warriors in Comanche, then turned back to the group. Running Bear will agree to this plan, but we want assurances that if violence comes, we will not stand alone. McBride nodded. You won't stand alone. I've got friends throughout the territory who are tired of the constant warfare. They're ready to support a different approach, but they need to see that it can work. As the sun set over the prairie, Sarah found herself at the center of a conspiracy that could reshape the future of Texas. The plan was risky, depending on precise timing and the cooperation of people who had every reason to distrust each other. But it offered something that neither continued warfare nor retreat could provide, the possibility of genuine change. When do we start? She asked. McBride smiled. We already have. Morrison's expedition is scheduled to arrive in 4 days. That gives us just enough time to set the stage for the most important performance any of us will ever give. Stone Wolf mounted his horse and prepared to return to his people with news of the plan. Before leaving, he approached Sarah one final time. You know that if this fails, you can never return to your old life, he said quietly. Win or lose, you will be changed by what comes next. Sarah looked around at her homestead, the cabin she'd shared with Thomas, the well where she'd first heard Ayana's cries, the prairie that had been her sanctuary for 2 years. She was about to risk everything on a gamble that most people would consider insane. I was changed the moment I decided to pull that boy out of the well, she replied. Everything else is just consequences. As Stone Wolf and his warriors disappeared into the gathering darkness, Sarah realized that the quiet life she'd tried to build for herself was officially over. In 4 days, she would either help create a new model for peace on the frontier, or she would become a casualty in a war that had been brewing since the first white settlers crossed the Mississippi. Either way, there was no going back. The morning of the 3rd day brought an unexpected complication that threatened to unravel McBride's carefully orchestrated plan. Sarah was preparing breakfast when she heard the distinctive sound of a military bugle echoing across the prairie. Through her window, she could see a column of blue-uniformed cavalry approaching from the southeast, at least 30 soldiers riding in precise formation. McBride emerged from his tent near the trading camp, his face grim as he studied the approaching force through his spyglass. That's Captain Henderson from Fort Davis. He's early, and he's not supposed to be here at all. Sarah felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. What does this mean for the plan? It means Morrison has more influence than I thought, McBride replied. Henderson wouldn't ride out here without direct orders from his superiors. Someone with real authority has decided to take Morrison's claims seriously. The territorial officials McBride had promised weren't due to arrive until tomorrow, which meant the military would be operating without civilian oversight. Sarah had seen enough frontier justice to know that soldiers faced with what appeared to be an Indian uprising rarely bothered with nuanced investigation. Stone Wolf and his warriors had withdrawn to concealed positions in the hills north of Sarah's homestead as planned, but their presence would be discovered the moment Henderson's scouts began a thorough reconnaissance. The delicate balance McBride had constructed was about to collapse before the main performance even began. Captain Henderson proved to be a lean, weathered man in his 40s with the bearing of someone who had seen considerable combat on the frontier. He dismounted 50 yards from Sarah's cabin and approached with his hand resting casually on his sidearm, a gesture that managed to be both respectful and threatening. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Captain William Henderson, United States Cavalry. I understand you've had some difficulties with hostile Indians in the area." Sarah chose her words carefully, knowing that everything she said would be analyzed for signs of coercion or mental instability. "I haven't had any difficulties, Captain. I've been going about my normal business without incident." Henderson's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's not the report I received from Jake Morrison. He indicated you'd been taken captive by a Comanche war party and were being held against your will." "As you can see, I'm free to speak for myself," Sarah replied. "Mr. Morrison was mistaken." "Mistaken about what exactly?" Henderson's tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to getting straight answers from civilians. Before Sarah could respond, McBride stepped forward with the confident stride of a man who knew how to deal with military officers. "Captain Henderson, Thomas McBride, Territorial Trading Commissioner. I believe there may be some confusion about the situation here." Henderson turned his attention to McBride, and Sarah could see him reassessing the dynamic. The presence of an official territorial representative complicated the simple rescue narrative Morrison had constructed. "Commissioner McBride, I wasn't aware of any territorial involvement in this matter." "Official territorial business, Captain. I'm here investigating reports of unauthorized military action against peaceful Indian bands." McBride's voice carried just enough authority to make Henderson hesitate. "I assume your presence here is related to the same matter." Henderson's expression grew guarded. Military officers learned early to be cautious when civilian authorities started asking pointed questions about their operations. "I received orders to investigate reports of Indian hostilities in this area and to provide assistance to any endangered civilians." "And what have you found?" McBride asked. Henderson looked around at the scene before him. Sarah standing calmly beside her cabin, McBride's trading party going about their normal business, no signs of violence or coercion anywhere in sight. "I'm beginning to wonder if my intelligence was accurate." This was the opening Sarah had been hoping for. "Captain, I believe you've been given false information. 3 weeks ago, Jake Morrison and his men attempted to attack a Comanche family who came to collect their injured son. When I refused to allow violence on my property, Morrison retreated. Now he's apparently spreading lies to justify a return visit." Henderson studied her face carefully, looking for signs of the mental instability Morrison had undoubtedly described. "You're saying Morrison fabricated the entire incident?" "I'm saying Morrison attacked children and then tried to cover it up by claiming he was defending me from hostile Indians." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Henderson was faced with a choice between believing a respected military contractor like Morrison or a lone woman whose story painted his informant as a liar and potential war criminal. "These are serious allegations, ma'am. Do you have any evidence to support them?" Before Sarah could answer, a commotion arose from Henderson's cavalry unit. One of his scouts had returned from a patrol of the surrounding area, and he was reporting something urgent to the sergeant. Henderson excused himself and walked over to receive the report. Sarah couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see Henderson's expression growing more serious as he listened. When he returned, his demeanor had shifted from cautious investigation to military alertness. "Ma'am, my scout reports signs of a significant Indian presence in the hills north of here. Fresh tracks, at least 15 to 20 warriors positioned in what appears to be a defensive formation." Henderson's hand moved closer to his weapon. "Now I'm wondering if Morrison's intelligence was more accurate than your denials suggest." Sarah felt the careful structure of McBride's plan beginning to collapse. The presence of Stone Wolf's warriors, which was supposed to demonstrate peaceful cooperation, was instead being interpreted as evidence of hostile intent. "Captain," McBride interjected, "those warriors are here at my invitation. They're part of official territorial negotiations for a trading agreement." Henderson's skepticism was evident. "Commissioner, with all due respect, conducting negotiations with hostile Indians without military escort is not standard territorial procedure. The Comanche bands involved have been designated as peaceful under territorial policy," McBride replied smoothly. "Chief Running Bear's people have maintained non-aggression agreements for over 2 years. Then why are they positioned defensively in the hills rather than openly in your camp?" It was a fair question, and one that exposed the weakness in their plan. The Comanche had taken defensive positions because they expected trouble from Morrison's force, but to Henderson it looked like preparation for an ambush. Sarah realized that someone needed to take control of the narrative before the situation deteriorated beyond repair. "Captain Henderson, would you be willing to meet with Chief Running Bear directly? You could ask him yourself about his intentions." Henderson considered this proposal carefully. Meeting with Indian leaders was within his authority as a military commander, and it would give him first-hand intelligence about their capabilities and intentions. "Under what circumstances?" "A formal parley under flag of truce," McBride suggested. "With your soldiers and his warriors both present as witnesses, complete transparency from all parties." The suggestion had merit from Henderson's perspective. A formal parley would allow him to assess the Comanche force while maintaining military protocol. If the Indians proved hostile, he'd be in position to respond appropriately. If they proved peaceful, he could report that back to his superiors and avoid unnecessary conflict. "Very well," Henderson decided. "I'll give Chief Running Bear 1 hour to present himself for parley. If he refuses or attempts deception, I'll consider his band hostile and act accordingly." McBride nodded agreement, though Sarah could see the concern in his eyes. They were improvising now, departing from the carefully planned scenario they'd prepared. Stone Wolf and his warriors were expecting Morrison's civilian force, not a military confrontation with territorial implications. As Henderson's messenger rode north to arrange the parley, Sarah found herself contemplating how quickly their situation had deteriorated. What was supposed to be a demonstration of peaceful coexistence was turning into a potential military incident that could trigger the very war they were trying to prevent. "McBride," she said quietly, "what happens if this goes wrong?" "Then we hope Running Bear is as wise as I think he is," McBride replied, "and we pray that Henderson is more interested in truth than in confirming his prejudices." The next hour passed with agonizing slowness. Henderson's soldiers took up positions that provided clear fields of fire while maintaining the appearance of peaceful intent. McBride's trading party continued their normal activities, but Sarah could see the tension in their movements. Everyone understood that they were balanced on the edge of violence. When Running Bear finally appeared, he did so with the dramatic flair that Sarah was beginning to recognize as characteristic of important Comanche occasions. He rode alone down from the hills, wearing full ceremonial dress and carrying a lance decorated with eagle feathers and painted symbols. Behind him, at respectful distance, rode Stonewolf and a dozen other warriors in similar regalia. The visual impact was immediate and powerful. These were not raiders or renegades, but representatives of a structured, dignified society coming to conduct formal business. Henderson's soldiers shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing that their expectations of savage hostility didn't match the reality before them. Running Bear approached within conversation distance, then dismounted, and walked forward with the measured pace of a diplomat. When he spoke, his English was clear and formal. "I am Running Bear of the Penatica Comanche. I come in peace to speak with the soldier chief." Henderson stepped forward, his military bearing matching Running Bear's ceremonial dignity. "I am Captain Henderson, United States Cavalry. I'm here to investigate reports of hostile activities in this area." "There have been no hostile activities by my people," Running Bear replied calmly. "We came to this place to honor the woman who saved my son's life. We came to discuss peaceful trade with the white traders. We came in friends." "Then why were your warriors positioned defensively in the hills?" Running Bear's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught a slight shift in his posture that suggested careful consideration of his response. "Because we were told that armed white men were coming who wished us harm. We prepared to defend ourselves if necessary, but we hoped it would not be necessary." The answer was honest and reasonable, but it raised new questions about who had provided. The Comanche with intelligence about Morrison's plans. Henderson's trained eye would have caught the implication immediately. "Who told you armed men were coming?" Henderson asked. "The trader McBride warned us that Jake Morrison sought revenge for being denied the chance to kill my son 3 weeks ago." Henderson turned to look at McBride, his expression sharp with suspicion. "Commissioner, you've been in communication with these Indians about military matters?" McBride met his gaze steadily. "I've been conducting legitimate territorial business, Captain. Part of that business involves preventing unnecessary conflicts that could destabilize the entire region. By coordinating with Indian war parties, by facilitating communication between territorial representatives and peaceful Indian leaders." McBride's voice carried the authority of his position. "Unless you're suggesting that territorial policy should be conducted without regard for preventing violence." Henderson found himself in a difficult position. Criticizing territorial policy decisions was outside his authority as a military officer, but ignoring potential security threats was a dereliction of duty. The situation required diplomatic skills that weren't taught at military academies. Running Bear seemed to sense Henderson's dilemma and offered a solution. "Soldier Chief, you are welcome to examine our camp and speak with our warriors. You will find weapons for hunting and for defense, but no preparation for war against your people." The offer was both generous and shrewd. It demonstrated confidence in their peaceful intentions while allowing Henderson to gather the intelligence he needed to write his report. It also publicly committed the Comanche to transparency, making any hidden hostile preparations impossible. Henderson considered the proposal for a long moment, weighing military protocol against diplomatic opportunity. Finally, he nodded. "I accept your invitation, Chief Running Bear. A joint inspection of both camps would be appropriate." As arrangements were made for the formal inspection, Sarah realized that McBride's plan was actually working, despite the unexpected complications. The arrival of military authority had initially seemed like a disaster, but it was providing something Morrison's civilian force couldn't offer: official credibility for whatever conclusions were reached. If Henderson's report confirmed the peaceful nature of the Comanche presence, it would carry far more weight with territorial authorities than McBride's word alone. Morrison's credibility would be permanently damaged, and the precedent for peaceful resolution of conflicts would be established at the highest levels, But the success of the plan now depended entirely on the next few hours. Henderson would be looking for any sign of deception or hostile intent, and the Comanche would be under scrutiny that could reveal any preparation for violence. One misinterpreted gesture or suspicious discovery could still trigger the very conflict they were all trying to avoid. As the strange procession formed, cavalry officers, Comanche warriors, territorial officials, and civilian traders all moving together toward the hills, Sarah reflected on how far she'd traveled from the simple act of pulling a child from a well. That moment of compassion had set in motion events that were now reshaping the political landscape of the entire territory. The question remained whether that reshaping would lead toward peace or toward war. The answer would be determined by what Henderson found in the Comanche camp, and by how both sides chose to interpret whatever they discovered there. Walking between worlds that had been at war for decades, Sarah Mitchell found herself hoping that the courage it had taken to save one child might be enough to save them all. The Comanche camp, nestled in a natural depression between two hills, was unlike anything Captain Henderson had expected to find. Instead of a military encampment prepared for war, he discovered what appeared to be a temporary village focused on family life and peaceful activities. Women were preparing food over carefully contained fires, children played supervised games with wooden toys, and elderly men sat in circles sharing stories and pipe smoke. Henderson's trained eye catalogued every detail as Running Bear led the inspection party through the camp. The weapons visible were indeed hunting implements and defensive arms. Bows designed for taking deer rather than fighting mounted enemies, lances decorated for ceremony rather than sharpened for battle. The horses showed signs of long travel, but no evidence of recent hard riding that would indicate raiding activity. Most telling was the presence of the elderly and very young. War parties didn't travel with grandmothers and toddlers. This was clearly an extended family group that had made the journey specifically for the purpose they'd stated, to honor Sarah Mitchell and participate in peaceful trade negotiations. Crow Feather, the medicine man Sarah remembered from their first encounter, approached the group carrying a bundle wrapped in soft leather. Through Running Bear's translation, he explained that he wished to demonstrate traditional Comanche healing practices as evidence of their peaceful intentions. My grandfather says that people who make war do not carry medicine bundles for healing. Running Bear translated, he offers to show your medicine chief how our people treat wounds and sickness. Henderson looked questioningly at his company surgeon, a young lieutenant named Bradley, who had accompanied the expedition. Bradley stepped forward with obvious curiosity, and for the next 20 minutes, Sarah watched a fascinating exchange between two very different medical traditions. Crow Feather displayed various herbs and explained their uses through Running Bear's translation, while Bradley demonstrated his surgical instruments and European-trained techniques. Despite the language barrier and cultural differences, both men clearly recognized professional competence in the other. Their mutual respect was evident and genuine. "Captain," Bradley said quietly, "this man knows more about treating arrow wounds and setting broken bones than most surgeons I've trained with. His knowledge is extensive and practical." Henderson nodded, filing away another piece of evidence that contradicted Morrison's narrative of savage hostility. These people possessed sophisticated knowledge and maintained complex social structures. They were not the mindless raiders Morrison had described. Stone Wolf appeared at Running Bear's side and spoke urgently in Comanche. The chief listened, then turned to Henderson with an expression of concern. "Captain, my brother reports that a large group of white men approaches from the south, perhaps 40 riders, moving fast and armed for war." Henderson immediately sent 2 of his scouts to confirm the report while ordering his remaining soldiers to defensive positions. The carefully orchestrated inspection was about to become something far more dangerous. "Morrison," McBride said grimly. "He's ahead of schedule." Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized the implications. Morrison's force would arrive expecting to find her held captive by hostile Indians. Instead, they would discover her free and unharmed, participating in what appeared to be a friendly gathering between military officers and Comanche leaders. Morrison's entire justification for his expedition would be revealed as false in the most public and humiliating way possible. "He won't be able to back down from this," Sarah said, "not with 40 men watching and his reputation on the line." Henderson was thinking the same thing. "Chief Running Bear, I need your people to remain calm regardless of what happens next. Any aggressive action could trigger a battle that none of us want." Running Bear spoke briefly to Stonewolf, who nodded and began moving through the camp, speaking quietly to the warriors. Sarah could see them taking positions that would provide protection for the women and children while maintaining defensive capabilities. Their movements were disciplined and purposeful, the actions of experienced fighters preparing for a confrontation they hoped to avoid. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and Henderson's scouts returned with confirmation of Stone. Wolf's report: 43 armed men led by Jake Morrison, riding hard and showing every sign of hostile intent. "Captain," one of the scouts reported, "they're flying a territorial militia flag and claiming official authority. Morrison's telling his men they're here on a government rescue mission." Henderson's expression darkened. Unauthorized use of territorial symbols was a serious offense, but more immediately concerning was the implication that Morrison had deceived his own men about the nature of their mission. 40 civilians who believed they were conducting an official rescue operation would be far more dangerous than 40 men who knew they were seeking personal revenge. "Sir," the scout continued, "they've got a cannon with them. Small field piece, but enough to cause serious damage. The presence of artillery changed everything." Morrison wasn't just planning to intimidate or threaten. He was prepared for siege warfare. The cannon could destroy Sarah's cabin from a safe distance and force the Comanche into open ground where they could be slaughtered by superior firepower. Running Bear absorbed this intelligence with the calm of a leader who had faced death many times before. "Captain Henderson, my people will not start this fight, but we will not allow ourselves to be murdered without defending our families." Henderson found himself in an impossible position. Military protocol required him to prevent conflict between civilians and Indians, but he had no authority to order Morrison's militia to stand down. If shooting started, his 30 soldiers would be caught between two forces, totaling over 60 armed men, with civilian casualties inevitable on all sides. McBride approached Henderson with an expression of grim determination. "Captain, I'm invoking my authority as Territorial Commissioner to place this situation under civilian jurisdiction. Morrison's actions constitute a threat to official territorial negotiations, which makes this a political matter rather than a military one. It was a legal maneuver that might or might not hold up under scrutiny, but it gave Henderson options he hadn't had before. If the situation was officially a civilian matter, he could position his forces as neutral peacekeepers rather than being forced to choose sides. "Commissioner, I'll respect your authority in this matter," Henderson replied carefully, "but I reserve the right to protect civilians and prevent massacre if negotiations fail." Sarah realized that she was about to become the central figure in a confrontation that would determine not just her own fate, but the future of white Indian relations throughout the territory. Morrison's expedition had been organized around the fiction of rescuing her from captivity. Her visible freedom and obvious cooperation with the Comanche would destroy that narrative completely. "McBride," she said quietly, "what happens when Morrison realizes his entire justification for being here was a lie? Then we find out whether he's more interested in maintaining his reputation or avoiding a massacre." McBride replied. Men like Morrison don't like being proven wrong publicly. The question is how far he'll go to avoid admitting his mistakes. The sound of Morrison's force was now clearly audible from the south. Dust clouds marked their approach, and Sarah could see individual riders beginning to emerge from the haze. At their head rode Morrison himself, his posture confident and aggressive as he led what he believed to be a righteous mission. Running Bear gathered his senior warriors around him and spoke in Comanche for several minutes. When he finished, Stone, Wolf and the others nodded grimly and began moving toward their positions. Whatever the chief had told them, it had prepared them for the worst, while hoping for the best. "Sarah," Running Bear said, approaching her with ceremonial formality, "what happens next will determine whether your act of kindness leads to peace or war. My people are ready to honor the debt we owe you, whatever the cost." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. Her decision to save Ayana had set all of this in motion, and now dozens of lives hung in the balance of how the next few minutes unfolded. Henderson deployed his soldiers in a line between the approaching militia force and the Comanche camp, with his cannon positioned to command the field. It was a textbook defensive formation, but Sarah knew that military tactics would matter less than psychology in what was about to unfold. Morrison's force crested the final hill and came into full view of the gathered assembly. Sarah could see the moment when Morrison realized that the situation was not what he had expected. His confident posture shifted to confusion, then anger, as he took in the scene before him. Instead of finding Sarah held captive by hostile Indians, he saw her standing freely among military officers, territorial officials, and Comanche leaders engaged in what appeared to be peaceful negotiations. His entire justification for the expedition, and for the dangerous rhetoric he'd used to recruit 40 armed men, was revealed as false in the most public way possible. Morrison raised his hand to halt his force about 100 yards away, close enough for conversation, but far enough to avoid immediate conflict. Sarah could see him conferring with his lieutenants, probably trying to decide how to proceed when the fundamental premise of their mission had been exposed as a lie. Finally, Morrison rode forward alone, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the prairie wind. "Sarah Mitchell, what in hell is going on here? We came to rescue you from Indian captivity, and I find you socializing with the enemy like they're invited guests." Sarah stepped forward, positioning herself where both forces could see and hear her clearly. This was her moment to either defuse the situation or watch it explode into violence. "Jake Morrison," she called back, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "I haven't needed rescuing from anyone. I've been conducting my own affairs on my own property without interference from hostile forces." "Don't lie to protect them," Morrison shouted. "These savages have obviously coerced you into saying that. No white woman in her right mind would willingly associate with Comanche murderers." The insult sparked immediate reaction from the Comanche warriors, but Running Bear raised his hand and spoke sharply in their language. His authority held them in place, but Sarah could see the tension in their postures. They would not tolerate many more provocations. Henderson rode forward to position himself between Morrison and the main groups. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Captain Henderson, United States Cavalry. I've conducted a thorough investigation of the situation here, and I can confirm that Miss Mitchell is free and unharmed. There's no evidence of coercion or hostile activity." Morrison's face grew even redder. "Captain, you've been deceived by Indian trickery. They're masters of deception, and they've obviously fooled you into believing their lies." "I've examined their camp personally," Henderson replied firmly. "These people are not equipped for war, and their behavior has been entirely peaceful. Your intelligence appears to have been inaccurate. The word inaccurate hung in the air like an accusation. Morrison had staked his reputation on the truth of his claims, and now a military officer was publicly contradicting him. For a man whose authority depended on being seen as an Indian fighter and protector of white settlers, the humiliation was unbearable. "You've all been fooled," Morrison declared, his voice rising to a shout. "This is exactly what these devils want, to make us let our guard down so they can strike when we're not expecting it." McBride rode forward to join Henderson. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Thomas McBride, Territorial Trading Commissioner. I can personally vouch for the peaceful intentions of Chief Running Bear's people. They're here at my invitation for official territorial business." Morrison stared at McBride with undisguised hatred. "So you're the one behind this. I should have known. You traders would sell your own mothers to the Indians if the price was right." "I'm conducting legitimate territorial policy," McBride replied calmly. "Policy that prioritizes peaceful resolution of conflicts over unnecessary violence." Peaceful resolution. Morrison's laugh was harsh and bitter. "There's only one kind of peace these savages understand, and that's the peace of the grave. You've been living in fantasy if you think they can be trusted." Sarah realized that Morrison was beyond rational argument. His worldview required the Comanche to be irredeemably hostile, because that hostility justified his own actions and identity. Evidence to the contrary wasn't enlightening to him, it was threatening. Running Bear seemed to reach the same conclusion. He rode forward with the dignity of a chief addressing equals, his voice carrying the formal tone of diplomatic discourse. "Jake Morrison," he said, his English clear and precise, "you have come to my people with violence in your heart and lies on your tongue. You shot at children and called it war. You spoke falsehoods and called it truth. You gather men for killing and call it rescue." Morrison's hand moved toward his weapon. "I don't have to listen to lectures from a red devil who probably has white blood on his hands. The only blood on my hands today will be yours if you threaten my family again," Running Bear replied, his calm tone making the threat even more chilling. The confrontation had reached the point of no return. Morrison couldn't back down without admitting that his entire expedition was based on lies, but pressing forward meant attacking peaceful civilians in front of military witnesses. Either choice would destroy him, but one choice would also destroy many other people. Sarah realized that someone had to break the deadlock before it exploded into violence. She walked forward, positioning herself directly between Morrison and Running Bear, her voice carrying clearly across the prairie. "Jake Morrison," she said, "you have a choice to make. You can admit that you were wrong about this situation and lead your men home with honor, or you can start a war that will kill innocent people and destroy your own reputation forever." Morrison stared at her with pure hatred. "You've betrayed your own kind, Sarah Mitchell. You've chosen savages over civilization, and you'll pay the price for that choice." "I've chosen compassion over hatred," Sarah replied. "If that makes me a traitor to civilization, then civilization needs to examine its values." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything the frontier represented. Sarah Mitchell, a lone woman standing between armed forces on the Texas prairie, had just declared that mercy was more important than racial loyalty, that kindness mattered more than conventional wisdom. Now everyone present would have to decide which vision of civilization they wanted to support. Morrison's response to Sarah's challenge came not in words, but in action. He wheeled his horse around and rode back toward his force, shouting orders that carried clearly across the prairie. "Prepare the cannon. These Indian lovers want to protect savages. They can die with them." The transformation in Morrison's men was immediate and chilling. Moments before, they had been uncertain volunteers on what they believed was a rescue mission. Now they were being ordered to fire artillery at civilians, including a white woman they had supposedly come to save. Sarah could see confusion and doubt spreading through their ranks as the reality of their situation became clear. But Morrison's authority held, backed by months of inflammatory rhetoric about Indian atrocities and the need for decisive action. The cannon crew began unlimbering their fieldpiece with practiced efficiency, while riflemen took positions that would provide covering fire for the artillery. Captain Henderson immediately responded to the threat, ordering his soldiers into combat. Formation. Mr. Morrison, stand down immediately. I will not permit artillery fire on civilians under any circumstances. You don't have authority over territorial militia, Morrison shouted back. We're here on official business, and we'll complete our mission regardless of military interference. Henderson drew his saber, a gesture that formalized his intent to use force if necessary. Mr. Morrison, you are threatening civilians under the protection of the United States Army. Stand down or face the consequences. The situation had devolved into exactly what Sarah had feared most, a three-way confrontation where any single shot could trigger a massacre. Morrison's militia faced Henderson's cavalry across a field where Comanche warriors waited in defensive positions, with civilians caught in the crossfire. Running Bear spoke sharply to his warriors, and Sarah saw them beginning to move. But they weren't retreating to safer positions. They were advancing to form a defensive line that would protect the women and children in their camp. Whatever happened next, the Comanche would not abandon their families. McBride rode toward Morrison's position, his hands raised in a gesture of negotiation. Morrison, think about what you're doing. You fire that cannon, and you'll be responsible for starting an Indian war that could consume the entire territory. The war's already started, Morrison replied. It started the moment white women began, choosing Indian savages over their own kind. Young Collins, the cowboy, who'd expressed doubts earlier, suddenly threw down his rifle and stepped away from Morrison's formation. Mr. Morrison, this ain't what you told us we were coming here to do. You said we were rescuing a captive woman, not attacking the army. Morrison's face contorted with rage at this public defection. Collins, get back in line, or I'll shoot you as a deserter. Deserter from what? Collins shouted back. We ain't soldiers, and this ain't a war. This is just you trying to start a fight because you can't admit you were wrong. The young man's courage seemed to give other members of Morrison's force permission to voice their own doubts. Sarah could see men throughout the militia formation looking uncertainty at their weapons, at the army soldiers facing them, at the Comanche families they were supposedly preparing to attack. Henderson seized the moment of uncertainty. Men of the territorial militia, you are currently in violation of federal law by threatening military personnel and civilians under army protection. Any man who stands down now will not be held responsible for following illegal orders. The offer created immediate division in Morrison's ranks. Several men began lowering their weapons, clearly uncomfortable with the direction their mission had taken. But the cannon crew, consisting of Morrison's most loyal followers, continued their preparations under his direct supervision. Stone Wolf appeared beside Running Bear and spoke urgently in Comanche. The chief listened, then nodded grimly and turned. To address Henderson, Captain, my brother reports that more riders approach from the east, perhaps 20 men moving fast. Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized their situation was about to become even more complicated. But as the new arrivals drew closer, she recognized the lead rider and felt a surge of hope instead of despair. It's Judge Patterson from Austin, McBride called out, his voice carrying relief and satisfaction. The territorial officials I promised. Judge Marcus Patterson was a man whose reputation preceded him throughout Texas territory. Known for his fairness, intelligence, and absolute integrity, he carried more moral authority than any military officer or civilian official. His presence would lend legitimacy to whatever resolution emerged from this confrontation. Patterson rode directly into the space between the opposing forces, apparently unconcerned about the loaded weapons pointed in multiple directions. His companions included territorial legislators, federal marshals, and what appeared to be newspaper correspondence. Exactly the kind of official witnesses who could document whatever happened next for posterity. "Gentlemen," Patterson announced, in a voice trained to carry across courtrooms, "I am Judge Marcus Patterson, representing the territorial government of Texas. I understand there's some confusion here about authority and jurisdiction." Morrison's confident demeanor flickered as he recognized the implications of Patterson's arrival. Federal marshals and territorial officials wouldn't be impressed by his claims of militia authority, and newspaper correspondence would ensure that whatever happened here became public knowledge throughout the territory. "Judge Patterson," Henderson said formally, "Captain Henderson, United States Cavalry. I'm currently preventing what appears to be an unauthorized attack on peaceful civilians by irregular militia forces." Patterson's keen eyes surveyed the scene, taking in every detail from the positioned cannon to the defensive formations of both military and Comanche forces. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of legal expertise and governmental power. "Mr. Morrison, I understand you've organized this expedition under claims of territorial authority. I'd like to see your official authorization." The request was simple and devastating. Morrison had been operating under the assumption that his actions would be judged after the fact, when he could control the narrative about what had happened. The presence of official witnesses demanding documentation in real time destroyed that strategy completely. "Judge, the situation here doesn't require paperwork," Morrison attempted. "We're dealing with hostile Indians who've taken a white woman captive. I see Miss Mitchell standing freely among military officers and territorial officials," Patterson replied dryly. "She appears remarkably uncaptive for someone who supposedly needed rescue." Sarah stepped forward, recognizing her opportunity to address the highest legal authority in the territory. "Your Honor, I want to state clearly, and for the record, that I have not been held captive by anyone. I have been conducting my own affairs on my own property in cooperation with peaceful Comanche representatives." Patterson nodded and gestured to one of his companions, who began writing rapidly in a leather-bound notebook. "Miss Mitchell, have you been coerced or threatened into making this statement?" "No, Your Honor. I'm speaking freely and truthfully." "And, Chief Running Bear," Patterson continued, turning to address the Comanche leader directly, "what brings your people to this location?" Running Bear responded with the formal dignity Sarah had come to expect from him. "Honored Judge, we came to thank the woman who saved my son's life and to discuss peaceful trade with territorial representatives. We have harmed no one and threatened no one." Patterson's companion continued taking notes, creating an official record that would be difficult for anyone to dispute later. The presence of legal documentation was clearly making Morrison's supporters increasingly uncomfortable. One of the federal marshals accompanying Patterson rode forward and addressed Morrison directly. "Sir, I'm Deputy Marshal Williams. I need to inform you that threatening federal officials and military personnel is a serious crime. I strongly advise you to order your men to stand down." Morrison found himself trapped between impossible choices. Standing down would mean admitting that his entire expedition was based on false premises, destroying his reputation and authority. But continuing to threaten federal officials in front of witnesses would result in criminal charges that could end with imprisonment or worse. The cannon crew looked to Morrison for orders, their faces showing confusion about whether to continue their preparations. The rest of his militia was clearly wavering, with more men stepping away from their positions as the legal implications of their situation became clear. Young Collins, emboldened by Patterson's presence, walked directly toward the judge. "Your Honor, most of us here were told we were coming on an official rescue mission authorized by the territorial government. We didn't know we'd be threatening the army or attacking peaceful Indians." Patterson nodded gravely. "Son, You've been deceived about the nature of this expedition. There is no territorial authorization for military action in this area, and there never was. The revelation hit Morrison's force like a physical blow. Men who had risked their lives and reputations based on Morrison's claims of official authority now realized they had been manipulated into participating in what amounted to an illegal military action. Morrison himself seemed to realize that his position had become untenable. Surrounded by federal marshals, facing military opposition, with his own men deserting and official witnesses documenting everything, he had no good options remaining. But rather than accept defeat gracefully, Morrison chose to double down on his hatred. Judge Patterson, you're all being fooled by Indian deception. These savages are planning to massacre every white family in the territory, and you're helping them do it. Mr. Morrison, Patterson replied with the patience of a man accustomed to dealing with desperate criminals, I've examined the evidence available here, and I find no support for your claims. What I do find is an unauthorized armed force threatening civilians and military personnel. Stonewolf had been listening to the exchange with growing impatience. He spoke briefly to Running Bear, who nodded and then addressed the assembled crowd in English. Judge, my brother asked me to tell you that Jake Morrison's words prove he will never accept peace between our peoples. He would rather see war than admit he was wrong about us. The observation was both accurate and damning. Morrison's refusal to acknowledge evidence that contradicted his prejudices demonstrated that he was motivated by hatred rather than legitimate security concerns. Patterson seemed to reach a decision. He gestured to the federal marshals, who immediately rode toward Morrison's position. Mr. Morrison, you are under arrest for threatening federal officials, impersonating territorial authority, and inciting violence against peaceful civilians. The arrest warrant was the final blow to Morrison's authority. His remaining supporters found themselves facing a choice between loyalty to a man who had deceived them and respect for legitimate federal law enforcement. The cannon crew, seeing federal marshals approaching with drawn weapons, finally abandoned their positions and walked away from the artillery piece. Without their support, Morrison found himself essentially alone. His militia dissolved and his authority evaporated. But Morrison's defeat created a new problem. Humiliated and facing criminal charges, he had nothing left to lose. Men in such positions often chose desperate final actions that could still trigger the violence everyone else was trying to prevent. Morrison drew his revolver and pointed it not at the approaching marshals, but at Sarah Mitchell. If I'm going down, the Indian-loving traitor is coming with me. The threat immediately transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Soldiers, marshals, and Comanche warriors all found themselves with weapons trained on Morrison, but none could fire without risking Sarah's life. Running Bear spoke sharply in Comanche, and Sarah saw Stonewolf beginning to move with the fluid grace of a warrior seeking position for a clear shot. But Morrison was too far away and too well positioned for anyone to stop him before he could pull the trigger. Morrison, Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the gun pointed at her heart, you've already lost everything. Don't add murder to your list of crimes. You made me lose everything, Morrison snarled. Your Indian-loving sympathies destroyed, my reputation and my livelihood. If I can't have justice, I'll have revenge. Judge Patterson stepped forward, his hands raised peacefully. Mr. Morrison, killing Miss Mitchell won't restore your reputation. It will only ensure that you're remembered as a murderer rather than a man who made mistakes. I didn't make mistakes, Morrison shouted. I was right about the Indians, and history will prove it. They'll massacre every white family in Texas, and it'll be because of traitors like her. Ayana suddenly appeared at the edge of the crowd, limping forward on his crutch despite the obvious danger. The boy who had started this entire chain of events was now walking directly toward the man who wanted to kill the woman who had saved his life. Stop, boy! Running Bear called out in English, but Ayana continued moving forward with the determined stride of someone who had made an irrevocable decision. Morrison swung his gun toward the approaching child, his face twisted with the hatred that had consumed his reason. "Stay back, you little savage, or I'll put you back in that well permanently." But Ayana didn't stop. Instead, he spoke in clear, careful English that carried across the prairie wind. "Mr. Morrison, Sarah Mitchell saved my life when she could. Have let me die. She is a good person. You are not a good person. Good people do not point guns at women who help children." The simple moral clarity of the child's words seemed to penetrate even Morrison's hatred-twisted mind. For a moment, his gun wavered as he stared at the boy he had tried to kill 3 weeks earlier. In that moment of hesitation, Stone Wolf struck. Stone Wolf's knife flew through the prairie air with deadly precision, striking Morrison's gun hand. Just as his finger began to squeeze the trigger, the revolver discharged harmlessly into the ground as Morrison screamed and clutched his wounded wrist, blood streaming between his fingers. Federal marshals immediately swarmed Morrison's position, disarming and restraining him, while Deputy Marshal Williams applied a tourniquet to prevent excessive blood loss. The man who had terrorized the frontier with his hatred was now just another criminal in custody, his power broken and his threats neutralized. Sarah sank to her knees as the adrenaline of facing death drained from her system. Ayana hobbled over. To her, his young face etched with concern as he helped steady her with his small hands. "Are you hurt, Sarah?" he asked in his careful English. "No, child. Thanks to you and Stone Wolf, I'm perfectly fine." Sarah looked up at the Comanche warrior, who had saved her life. "Thank you." Stone Wolf retrieved his knife and cleaned it methodically before responding. "You saved Running Bear's son. Today we are even." Judge Patterson approached, his legal mind already processing the implications of what had just occurred. "Miss Mitchell, are you able to give testimony about what happened here today?" Sarah nodded, still shaky but determined to see justice done. "Yes, Your Honor. I want everything on the record." The next several hours transformed Sarah's homestead into an impromptu courthouse as Patterson conducted formal hearings to document the events of the past month. Witnesses were called, testimony was recorded, and evidence was catalogued with the thoroughness that would be required for federal prosecution. Morrison, his hand bandaged and his spirit broken, was charged with multiple federal crimes, including impersonating territorial authority, threatening federal officials, assault with a deadly weapon, and inciting violence against peaceful civilians. The charges carried potential sentences that would keep him imprisoned for decades. Most of his militia members were released after giving testimony that confirmed they had been deceived about the nature of their mission. Young Collins and several others volunteered to testify against Morrison at his eventual trial, ensuring that his crimes would be fully documented in federal court. Captain Henderson provided military testimony that officially designated Running Bear's band as peaceful and non-hostile, establishing a legal precedent that would protect them from future unauthorized attacks. His report would become part of territorial policy regarding relations with Comanche tribes. But perhaps most significantly, Judge Patterson announced that the territorial government would be implementing new policies based on what had been demonstrated. At Sarah's homestead, the successful cooperation between whites and Indians would serve as a model for future interactions throughout Texas. "What we've witnessed here," Patterson declared as the official proceedings concluded, "proves that peaceful coexistence between different peoples is not only possible, but beneficial for everyone involved. The territorial government intends to make this approach the cornerstone of our Indian policy going forward." McBride stepped forward with a leather portfolio containing documents he'd been waiting for the right moment to present. "Your Honor, I have here signed agreements for trading partnerships between territorial merchants and Comanche bands, contingent on the establishment of peaceful relations. Chief Running Bear has indicated his people's willingness to participate." Running Bear nodded formally. "My people wish to trade in peace rather than fight in war. We offer buffalo hides, horses, and safe passage through our lands in exchange for metal tools, cloth, and fair treatment under your laws." The agreements Patterson signed that afternoon would reshape the economic and political landscape of Texas for generations to come. Instead of constant warfare draining resources and lives, cooperative trade would bring prosperity to both white settlers and Indian tribes. As the sun began to set over the prairie, the various groups prepared to depart. Federal marshals loaded Morrison into a prison wagon for transport to Austin, where he would await trial. Judge Patterson and his officials gathered their documentation for the journey back to the territorial capital. Captain Henderson's cavalry would escort the federal party partway before returning to Fort Davis with orders to implement the new peaceful policies. The era of automatic military response to Indian presence was officially ending. Running Bear's people began breaking camp for their return journey north, but not before a final ceremony that surprised everyone present. Crow Feather approached, Sarah carrying an ornate ceremonial dress made from the finest buckskin and decorated with intricate beadwork. Through Running Bear's translation, the medicine man explained that the dress was a gift of the highest honor, worn only by women who had performed acts of extraordinary courage and compassion. By accepting it, Sarah would become an honorary member of the Pennateca Comanche band, with all the rights and protections that entailed. Sarah accepted the gift with tears in her eyes, understanding that she was receiving more than clothing. She was being welcomed into a family that would consider her one of their own for the rest of her life. Ayana, now walking confidently with only a slight limp remaining from his injury, presented Sarah with his own gift, a small carved wooden horse that he had made during his recovery in her cabin. "So you remember me," he said shyly. "I could never forget you," Sarah replied, kneeling to embrace the boy who had changed her life. "You're the bravest child I've ever known." Running Bear approached for his own farewell, his dignified bearing, unchanged despite everything they had all endured together. "Sarah Mitchell," he said formally, "you have given my people a great gift, not just the life of my son, but the possibility of peace between our peoples. How can such a debt be repaid? By raising Ayana to be the kind of man who would help others the way you all helped me," Sarah replied. "By teaching your people that not all whites are enemies. By remembering that compassion is stronger than hatred." Running Bear nodded solemnly. "These lessons will be remembered in the stories our children tell their children. Your name will live in Comanche memory as long as our people exist." As the Comanche rode north toward their winter camps, Stone Wolf paused beside Sarah's porch. In his improving English, he said something that would stay with her forever. "You are a small woman who became a big warrior, not with weapons but with heart. This is true strength." McBride remained behind with his trading party to finalize the commercial agreements that would implement the new peaceful policies. As they worked by lamplight in Sarah's cabin, he shared his vision of what the territory could become. "Within 5 years, we'll have established trading posts throughout Comanche territory," he explained. "Instead of military forts designed for war, we'll have commercial centers designed for cooperation. The economic benefits will make peace more profitable than warfare for everyone involved." Sarah listened to his plans with fascination and hope, but she also understood that the success of these grand schemes would depend on countless individual acts of courage and compassion by ordinary people making difficult choices. The next morning brought a steady stream of visitors as news of the confrontation spread throughout the territory. Some came to congratulate Sarah on her stand for peace, others to criticize her for betraying white solidarity. But the official backing of the territorial government gave her position legitimacy that her critics couldn't easily dismiss. Martha Henley arrived from Cedar Falls with news that the town was split in its reaction to Morrison's arrest. His hardcore supporters claimed he was being persecuted for defending white interests, but most citizens were embarrassed by his violent extremism and grateful that bloodshed had been avoided. "The preacher's been saying that what you did shows the true Christian spirit," Martha reported. "Loving your enemies, showing mercy to those in need, choosing peace over violence. He's using your story as an example in his sermons." Over the following weeks, Sarah discovered that her homestead had become a symbol of the new territorial policies. Dignitaries, journalists, and curious settlers made pilgrimages to see the place where white Indian cooperation had triumphed over hatred and violence. She used the attention to advocate for the expansion of peaceful policies throughout the territory. Her speeches, widely reported in territorial newspapers, combined practical arguments about the economic benefits of peace with moral arguments about the Christian duty to show compassion to all people. The well where she had first found Ayana became a particular focus of symbolic attention. Visitors would peer into its depths and marvel at how one moment of human decency in that dark space had changed the course of history for an entire territory. But Sarah's greatest satisfaction came from the letters she began receiving from other parts of Texas, and eventually from territories throughout the American West. People wrote to tell her about their own efforts to build bridges between white and Indian communities, inspired by her example to choose cooperation over conflict. A year later, Sarah stood once again beside her well, but this time she wasn't alone. Ayana had returned with his family for the first annual treaty celebration that commemorated the peaceful resolution of what historians were already calling the Mitchell Crisis. The boy had grown taller and stronger, his broken leg completely healed, and his English remarkably improved. He had become something of a celebrity among his people as the child whose rescue had led to historic peace agreements. "Sarah," he said, using the perfect pronunciation he had practiced all year, "my father says I should ask you something important." "What's that, Ayana? He says you saved my life, but I think maybe I saved yours too." "Do you think that's true?" Sarah considered the question seriously. The past year had brought challenges and changes she could never have imagined. Her quiet life as a widow on the frontier had been replaced by a public role as an advocate for peace and cooperation. She had gained influence and purpose, but lost the simple solitude she had once treasured. "I think we saved each other," she finally answered. "And maybe we helped save a lot of other people too." Running Bear approached, now wearing a mixture of traditional Comanche dress and white man's clothing that symbolized the blending of cultures the peace treaties had made possible. "Sarah," he said with a smile, "Ayana has one more question for you." The boy looked up at her with the serious expression she remembered from their first meeting. "Sarah, when I grow up and have children, will you teach them the same things you taught me? About helping people who are different and being brave." When it's hard, Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized that her influence would extend far beyond her own lifetime. The values she had demonstrated would be passed down through generations of Comanche children, who would grow up knowing that peace was possible between peoples who seemed destined to be enemies. "I promise," she said solemnly, "but I think they'll learn more from your example than from my words." As the sun set over the Texas prairie, Sarah Mitchell stood surrounded by friends who had once been strangers, allies who had once been enemies, and children who represented a future built on hope rather than hatred. The well that had brought them together remained, but it was no longer a symbol of desperation and rescue. Instead, it had become a symbol of the depths people would go to help each other, and the heights that human compassion could reach when Given the chance to flourish, the woman who had saved a Comanche child from a well had discovered that sometimes, when you save someone else, you end up saving yourself. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you end up saving the world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.